Welcome everyone to the Women Automotive Network's April Leadership Interview. Our guests this month are Men for Inclusion, and we're looking at rethinking your DEI strategies and the role that men can play. As a quick introduction, I'm Stephanie May from the Women Automotive Network, and I'll let Mark and Gary introduce themselves and Men for Inclusion shortly. To kick things off, though, I'd like to encourage everyone to use the chat on the side, get involved in the conversation. This is a LinkedIn Live where we can all share our best practices and experiences. For those of you that don't know, the Women Automotive Network has always been about women, not just for women. And I think now more than ever, it's important to have both sides of the conversation involved. And I'm really excited to welcome Mark and Gary this month. So over to you. Who are you both and why did you set up Men for Inclusion?
Thanks. Shall Mary, Mark or Gary go first?
Yeah, whoever.
whoever.
You go, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Welcome, everybody. My name's Mark Freed. I set up Men for Inclusion a few years ago now with Gary. My backstory is over recent years, I've become more aware, I guess, as we've become more inclusive of my dyslexic superpowers. And tend not to hide my lack of academic qualifications these days, which is great. It just shows how society is changing. I left my last proper job in the city 25 years ago and established a firm called E2W. E2W supported and helped and still does women to flourish and succeed in their financial services careers. I had the pleasure of supporting and helping thousands of women to do just that over the last 25 years. But what I got from that was a real understanding, as much as a man can have, of the challenges and barriers that women face in their careers. A few years ago now, I was getting really frustrated at the pace of change. You've only got to look at things like gender pay gap stats and other indicators to realize that despite all of the commitments, all of the strategies that were being put in place, we weren't progressing very quickly. And I began to think, well, why am I quite often the only man in the room when we were talking at women's networks? If we were talking at ethnicity networks, I'd be quite often the only white guy in the room, or LGBT, I'd be the only straight guy in the room. And what I thought is we need more men. We needed more men passionate about diversity and inclusion if we were going to move forward and accelerate into the type of workplaces and the type of society that I want to live in, and hence established Men for Inclusion.
Perfect. And Gary, what's your side of the story? How did you get involved?
Sure. Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you again for opportunity to work with you and the team here today. So my journey around this particular subject probably started about 10 years ago, so not quite as long ago as Mark's. I was working at JP Chase, large financial services provider. I was a managing director there, actually, as part of their global technology team. And I was asked to sponsor, as you do as a senior leader, a brand new network, Women in Technology. Technology, as you probably know, has a real problem as well of attracting and retaining women. Typically in the UK, it's about 20 to 25% of the workforce. JP Morgan wanted to do something about that, and I was asked to be the executive sponsor of this new Women in Technology group. So I suddenly started finding myself on a fairly regular basis in a room full of 50 women, a bit like Mark. I was often the only man, actually very uncomfortable. And we were really trying to explore why it was that women don't seek careers in technology, and if they do, they weren't sticking around as long as the men. Now, up until that point, I'd always thought of myself as a decent manager, a reasonable kind of leader. I thought I kind of treated everyone fairly. I thought I led with empathy, all that stuff. But I started hearing some stories that things that were happening to my female colleagues that were clearly invisible to me. I didn't realize they were going on. And I started to think, actually, maybe I'm part of the problem. So we decided, in fact, this was a woman's idea. It certainly wasn't mine. We decided to set up a male allies group about 10 years ago. There weren't many blueprints of what an allies group did at the time. So we kind of made it up as we went along a little bit. But over the next sort of 5-6 years, we started creating a movement, if you like, within JP Morgan of trying to, get men to a room and start having a conversation about gender equality and what we could do to help, get more women into the arena, and also how to make sure they stuck around when we got there. I left JP Morgan 2020. Start of COVID, had a bit of time on my hands. I wrote a book about the subject, The Accidental Sexist, with one of my partners at JP Morgan, about that male ally experience. And then through that kind of bumped into Mark, because we kind of thought this was a subject that other organizations might want to find out a little bit more about. And also this real belief that if we want gender equality, we want a more diverse and inclusive workforce, then it has to be about everyone. So therefore, we have to find ways of getting everyone into the conversation. As Mark indicates.
And 10 years ago to start is quite a long time, isn't it, really? And before we go into the kind of the differences over the last 10 years, why do you both think it's so important to be men part of that conversation and for us to have male allies?
So let me start, and Mark, jump in. I mean, I think it's fair to recognise that certainly in Western Europe and in the US that straight white men are still likely to be the most in the most senior positions in most organisations. We can see that from our gender pay gap reporting, etc. Et so I think we have to realise that it's a constituency around the subjects which are quite important to engage. I think first and foremost. Secondly, I think this conversation about inclusion is a conversation about all of us. It's not just a conversation about women. I think often we talk about gender equality and think it's equated to women's rights or whatever. And those are important things, don't get me wrong, but it is a broader conversation, right? There are multiple genders. And I think therefore everyone, I think we need everyone to be part of that conversation. But most importantly, and I think, Mark and I found this through our journey through this, we think there's something in it for them. We think there are benefits to men of being strong supporters, strong advocates for diverse and inclusive kind of organizations. We think it makes their ability to perform better. It makes their lives better. It gives them more happiness at work. So we think there's something in it for them as well. Mark.
Thanks. I'll just pick up on that point that Gary's made there about the what's in it for men. I think if we look back historically, we've seen over the last 20 or 30, 40, 50 years even, women really sort of freeing themselves from complying with outdated female stereotypes. You're no longer tied to the kitchen sink. That's an outdated term, but it is outdated because you have done that, and with that you've brought choice and opportunity to your lives. You can get to the top of your careers. You can lead organizations. We've seen women astronauts. We've seen women creating vaccines to save us from COVID. Women airline pilots. And top female sports stars. I was at Twickenham at the weekend watching the England-Ireland game, and just fantastic female role models. But also you have the choice and the opportunity to be working mothers, or indeed stay-at-home mothers. When you look at how far men have progressed in freeing themselves from outdated male stereotypes, I think we're 15, 20 years behind. You've only got to look at the uptake of paternity leave to realize that men aren't taking the opportunities and having the choices, having better work-life balance, being able to be more vulnerable and open, have better health outcomes, and frankly, be much better leaders, because we're still complying and tied by these outdated male stereotypes. So I think, apart from the fact that we can't do it without men, we can't get to a more diverse and inclusive world without them. We need to include them in the journey and recognize and help them understand that this is a win-win, not a zero-sum game.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting because, all the conversations that we have at the Women Automotive Network are about, returning to work and maternity and empowerment and what's happened with the work-life balance after COVID. And now we need to kind of look, like you've just said, that yes, we've improved to a certain extent, but what's happening with the males in society, they only have 2 weeks paternity leave. And even then, it's completely different. I think Salima's putting in the chat here, what's the difference between Europe and North America? Maternity and paternity leave globally, it's just completely different. So really interesting to think how women have actually freed themselves more than men in the last 50 years.
Yeah, and it's interesting when Gary and I are doing our working with leaders in industry, and we start having these safe space conversations with them. How many men talk really positively about the opportunity of working from home that COVID gave them, and how that opened their eyes to a new world? Now, quite often when we think about lockdown and we hear, and I've got total empathy for those stories of women who were homeschooling, managing a job, managing the house, etc., etc. Total empathy for that. But men had a lot of men had the most amazing opportunity to be in the heart of the family during that time, and they don't want to give that up. But we very rarely talk about it. It very rarely makes the news. We very rarely have conversations about it. And we see quite a lot these days is the um, uh, people trying to stop the rush back to the office. Um, and it's always just, and the arguments are quite often just about women and working mothers. Actually, we should make it about all of us.
Yeah, definitely. I think one good thing maybe came out of COVID, that whole working from home and the work-life balance. But as a new mum myself in those times, it's a completely different cultural, societal question that needs reevaluating. That until I think you become a parent, you don't really realize how much of a struggle or how much of a balance it really is to return to work and look after children. So how can we engage men in conversations? Obviously, we've got a LinkedIn Live now. We're talking about rethinking D&I. We're talking about 10 years ago at JP Morgan that you set up a male ally internal network. And obviously here at the network, we always try to get male speakers and we have our Male Champion Award. But how can we really engage though in the conversation? And, why should we?
So Stephanie, I think one of the things we have to start with is make it clear that this is not a conversation that needs to start with any sort of blame or any guilt, right? I think we're all the victims, if that's the right word, of the way in which we think in very genderized ways. It's we can't help it, right? We're brought up that way. It continues to be kind of particularly for sort of in social situations, people think in very gendered way. So I think it's that's a starting point. We can't start from that. And I think one of the places where perhaps we've gone a little bit wrong with our D&I strategies in the past is when we've kind of sort of started with this idea of sort of like bringing men into a room and sort of telling them that they're biased, or telling them that they're privileged, or telling them that they're aggressive, albeit in a micro way. Also, so giving them a series of really not very positive messages, if you like. So I think the first and foremost, if we're kind of going to get people into a room, I think the first thing you have to do is try and listen to them, actually ask them what they think, right? And actually that was our approach a little bit at JP Morgan. It was to get men in a room and not to say them were bad. It was certainly to say, look, there's some bad things happening, but try and engage them in like, what should we be doing about it? Let's hear from you. Let's hear, let's hear your thoughts on this. We have all got, I would hope, experiences of working in, diverse kind of situations. Certainly for men, I'm sure most men have a mother, a wife, a daughter, a sister, or whatever. So some, female person they can relate to. So let's have a conversation about if less than perfect things are happening, what do you think we should be doing about it? So try and bring them into, a very open conversation. I mean, there's certainly a need to make sure there is awareness, and you know, the awareness that certainly in the world of work, you know, there are different lived experiences based on gender. You know, we think that our data shows that and many other people's data shows that time and time again. And we know there's things like the gender pay gap that show that too. So we know there are systemic problems, but let's open up a conversation of, so what can we start thinking we could do about it? And, you know, why should we do something about it?
And I can see in the chat here that most of the comments are from females. So I'm just going to ask, you know, how many men are listening in the audience right now? Please write it in the chat. Let's see you. Let's hear you. Get involved in the conversation. And then to those women that I can see that's writing in the chat, did you invite your male colleagues to join this? Can you spread the word afterwards? You know, how many of you actually reached out your hand as well? We'll see what the replies are. Click refresh. In the meantime, we've always talked about male allies, male champions, and the new kind of word in the last 12 to 24 months is inclusion leaders, isn't it? And this is something Mark and I touched upon. You know, what do we really want? Who do we want by our side, and what do we want them talking about?
It's a great question, Stephanie. I think part of the problem here is we've kind of alienated men on our journey. I think if we're just talking diversity, it can be quite divisive. And, you know, as Gary pointed out, you know, unconscious bias and microaggression, and we've blamed men a lot. And then we're kind of asking them to turn up and be allies. And we have to think, well, what do we want them to do? And quite a lot, when we ask that question, quite a lot of people say it's kind of to support and help women to succeed. And we kind of look at that and we think, well, is that what we want? Are we saying that we want an ally to support and help women and others from underrepresented groups to flourish and succeed, but in the current culture, in the current environment, with the current behaviors? And therefore is what we're asking an ally to do is to coach, mentor and train you to succeed in my world by being like me? Or do we want an inclusion leader? An inclusion leader maybe turns the mirror on themselves and also drives that cultural and behavioral change so that we can all work in a more inclusive environment. So one of the things that's commonly said is that, you know, women get interrupted more than men in meetings. You know, an ally may, for example, coach and mentor and train that woman to speak up, to have more presence, to lean in. Whereas an inclusion leader will change the way the meetings run, so everybody gets heard. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's what
it makes sense, doesn't it? But in practice, how do we actually get there?
That's where we come in, and this isn't an opportunity to do a sales pitch, but I think it is changing that culture, changing those mindsets, and engaging men and leaders, not just men, leaders in becoming more inclusive.
I want to ask, one of the points in the descriptions about this LinkedIn Live was the traditional approach versus the EDUs and the new models. Do you guys want to talk about kind of your real experiences, some of the companies that you've already worked with, and what is working, and what's the difference? You know, how can we move from traditional to new models?
I think let's talk about the old models first of all, and what people have traditionally done, and then Gary maybe can come on and talk about what EDUs and what we do. I think, you know, when I look at firms' diversity statements and diversity strategies on their websites and on their gender pay gap reports, etc., the focus is normally on, and if I could sum it up, fixing the women and blaming the men. Yeah. So they'll talk about more recruitment. Yeah. They'll talk about leadership training courses. They'll talk about unconscious bias training. This all essentially either is supposed to fix representation and doesn't, or helps people to succeed in the current cultures. And we're not getting very far by doing that. And in fact, recent research has shown that almost 60% of UK men think that DE&I has gone too far. And they're now the victimized group. And actually 40% of women think that as well. So clearly what we need to do is change the narrative, and we need to change the way we do things and the way we move forward. And Gary, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, I want to just add at this point that I think what we're trying to achieve, and let's face it, if we just use gender as our example, gender equality in the workplace, it's not like this is a new thing. We've been trying.
You said you've been 10 years now as a male ally.
It's only 10. But, I mean, equal opportunity legislation came into the UK in the kind of early 70s, I think, right? So it's a very long journey, and I think it's fair to say we've probably also stood on the shoulders of a few giants along the way. But I think it kind of recognises that actually what we're trying to do is really quite difficult, right? Because if it were easy, then we would have probably done it, some years ago. So I think we have to, and I think it's easy to be a little bit critical of organisations, but I think we have to recognise that this is quite hard work. And actually going to our sort of starting off point, if you like, here's another reason why we want men, because it is hard work, and therefore, if our approach is to rely on a very small sector of our business at the sides of their desk to implement significant change back into our business, that's a difficult strategy to implement, I think. So often, our D&I strategy is reliant on kind of, I don't know, employee resource groups or business resource groups who are a bunch of, passionate individuals at the side of their desk trying to make this humongous sort of change in kind of culture and other things within their organization. That's a really difficult ask, I think. And unsurprisingly, and also actually the people being asked to do this, and because they're often the people that are in that kind of, traditionally underrepresented group. So A, they've got to do that on top of their day job. And B, to be fair, are we giving them the skills to do it? I mean, are they experienced change management, transformational change agents? I mean, they may be, but often they're not. They're just doing it because they've got a passion and don't necessarily have the skills. So I think one of the things I think we're beginning to see is people recognize it's difficult, recognize that we've tried a few things, and because it's difficult, we're all kind of learning together a little bit, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say that there are companies that are experimenting with, with trying different things and kind of tweaking and moving forward as they figure that out. But I think the fundamental thing is, I think organizations that are getting more mature about this are now beginning to think about this like a strategic change program. And all those things like resource groups and ERGs, BRGs, all those types of things are necessary, and they are great things, don't get me wrong, but they need more than just that, right? It needs to come with some, if you like, horizontal kind of things that are kind of pulling it all together. So again, I mean, I know there's always budget and money that's involved in this. There's no getting away from that. It needs time, resources, and efforts.
I think, like you said, though, time is one of the most crucial things. Absolutely. As you've highlighted, the amount of people that are doing this just because it's a passion as an aside job, it's going to take a long time. But hopefully together we'll get the resources, we'll get the budgets, and see what we can do. So this transformational program.
It is, and and it needs to feel like a transformational program in some way, right? It needs to have the trappings of what those programs look like. So it needs certainly executive sponsorship, and actually visible executive sponsorship.
Right.
And what Mark and I are seeing is actually we are seeing a lot of very inclusive leaders in those senior management positions. I mean, so I think we're beginning to see that the executive embrace inclusive leadership. We're seeing a lot of that. So they're beginning to think in that way. So they recognize, the really good ones, that they are not always getting it right. So they're still open to learning. They're still open to showing a little bit of vulnerability, but they are beginning to try and lead from the front. And you need that. You need that executive sponsor, but you need someone who's actually visible and actually trying to be authentic, and kind of role model the type of behaviors that you want to see, because people spot inauthenticity very quickly, don't they? Right. So
yeah.
So I think we're beginning to see that, and also then we're beginning to think people begin to see this as, rather than a series of transactions, like, oh, we do something for Pride Month and then we do something else for Black History Month, and it's just a series of disconnected things. We're going to see, right, here's a program of work with a bit of a realization of the outcomes we're trying to achieve, and also a bit of a plan about how we might achieve it, and some resource and some funding that goes alongside that. That's what a change program looks like. You may not always have the money or the same level of budget every year. That's always a challenge, and you've always got to prioritize against other business priorities. But at least thinking structurally how the program needs to look like a transformational program, that's a massive start point. And I think we're beginning to see more and more companies kind of approach it in that way.
So I'm going to leave a bit of time for the audience to maybe put some comments in the chat about what they're doing that they're finding is working, and what you're finding that really isn't working. Maybe you're getting pushback on, maybe you want to have some advice about. And in the meantime, maybe Mark, you can tell us what some of the companies that you're already working with are doing that isn't working, that maybe we should stay clear of. And then obviously a couple of questions.
All right, brilliant. So I think Gary's summed it up. There's sort of the big picture there. I'm very sceptical when I read firms who say they've got or putting in place recruitment strategies. I'm yet to talk to a hiring manager that says, I want to go out and find diverse candidates for this vacancy that I'm sitting on. Usually they say, I'm after the best person for the job. Their recruitment process is then aligned to cost of hire and time to hire. So what they're actually finding is they're getting a load of male candidates for roles that are male dominated, that are the cheapest and quickest to find. And you can tinker with that, but unless you put budget, time and money and effort into going out and finding female candidates, and you've got a hiring manager that really wants a diverse candidate, then they're all going to fail quite naturally. I think there are other things that we see that we're quite skeptical about. Gary just talked then about sort of ERGs that are just, or diversity inclusion initiatives that are just putting on one event after another, and expecting things to change as a result of that.
Ticking the box, right?
Ticking the
box. Like you said, each month, what's the focus? Yeah.
And quite often leadership giving those ERGs responsibility for DE&I. They're thinking it's all going to be fixed by those people who quite often, more often than not, are doing it off the side of their desk. With no authority, no strategy to rewrite HR policies and procedures and things. But the biggest thing I think that I see is the overemphasis on diversity rather than inclusion. Unless we get the culture, behaviors and values right, we can have as many women join the industry as we want, but they won't stay, they won't progress, and we won't get the benefits of a diverse workforce. So and very few firms look as if they are spending any kind of money, budget, or on anything really to do with inclusivity and changing those cultures. And if they do, they actually naturally draw men into the conversation, because inclusivity is good for us all. And inclusivity is something we can exercise every day of our lives, every second of our lives. It's a muscle. Whereas diversity, we only get the opportunity to hire irregularly.
I like the idea, that it's a muscle that needs constant exercise. Caroline Trudell's put into the group, what do you recommend as a way to engage men who don't believe in modern DE&I at all, because they didn't get to benefit from these programs, or maybe they're starting off rejecting that inequality exists altogether? So I think we've said this, as soon as you walk into the room and the shoe's on the other foot, you're alienating people already. So it's about having those open conversations and about inviting people to the conversation. Is there anything that perhaps you could add for her?
Yeah, I'd like to add something like that. One of the things we look at, Stephanie, is this idea of what we call the lived experience gap. So the book, The Accidental Sexist, came from one of our co-authors, a woman called Dr. Jill Armstrong, had done a 3-year research program on this subject for Cambridge University. And she found 16 very specific things that tend to happen to women in their careers that don't happen to men, or at least don't happen to men as much. And actually, Mark and I are increasingly finding that that's also true for people from other traditionally underrepresented groups, right? They're very specific. They're down to like who gets asked to do all the admin for the team, right? Who gets the most exciting opportunity, when there's a new project coming up, through to how we kind of bond socially and therefore create opportunities through social networks, which are often very gendered, right? So these kind of very small things that lead to a difference in the male-female experience at work, we think is one of the big barriers. And one of the things that does create some of these differences in who succeeds, who gets promoted, and so on and so forth. So we think there's about 16 of these. And one of the things we end up doing is we tend to measure this. Right, we tend to measure that there is this gap between men and women, and therefore we measure with organisations we work with to show that there is, and usually we find something like a 20 to 30% differential in the male-female experience. So I think one of the things we need to start with is the fact that this is happening. We find a lot of organisations that say, when we say to them more generally, there's these systemic issues, they go, yeah, that's terrible, but it doesn't happen here because we're really inclusive. Right, and then we measure it and then find it always happens there. It happens in every company. It's almost impossible that it's not. So I think we start from the fact that we can show that there is data, and some people need the data, not everyone. We can show there is data showing there is this difference in experience, and it's very precise. Right? It's very specific, and it comes down to women have to prove their competency more than men. That's shown over and over again. So of course you can imagine how that impacts objective conversations, performance management conversations, promotion conversations. You can see how all these dynamics play out in the workforce. But once you know about these things, you can think about, well, there are strategies we can begin to deploy that can close some of those gaps. And that's not to say these things don't happen to men. They do. They just don't happen as much. So we take the admin one, right? So, we end up by default asking women to do more of the admin, which is not part of their job. Then we can just make sure that starts getting balanced out across the team, right? We have a admin rota, or we make
really
sure
small changes can make a big difference. And if I think about that myself, the amount of time that I probably waste in a week or a month doing those little things, like you think you just get swept under the rug. Interesting.
Caroline, Gary, I think you've answered Caroline's second question about men rejecting this really well. I think it's really important also to answer the first question is, okay, how do we get them engaged? And certainly through the work that we do by creating a safe space for men to talk about this and have conversations, sometimes with their female colleagues present, but often just men in the room. And we start talking and not accusing them of being biased or privileged, but we start talking to them about the what's in it for me. Yeah. And what we find is what we've traditionally done is demotivated men to get involved in this. We've called them biased, and et cetera, et cetera. What we find is there's a whole bunch of motivators that will get men engaged when they realize that this is a win-win. Yeah. Now, that could be at the top of the tree, and I think the biggest motivator for most men is actually, if you dig a little bit, we all identify with some diverse characteristics ourselves. I started off the conversation today by saying I'm dyslexic. So an inclusive world benefits me because I relate. I also come from a working class background. Might not sound it these days, might not look it these days, but that was my background. You come down another level, and and actually, a lot of men talk really passionately about how they've been inspired by the women around them, and want to change the world for them. That could be their mothers, their sisters, their wives, their daughters, yeah, who we had an example recently about a chap, and we talked to him about accidental sexisms, and he said, yeah, I recognize it. I recognize it in my daughter's football team, because when I took her to football to start playing, she was shown to the worst pitch, had the worst kit, had the worst balls, the worst referees. She had a poorer lived experience. And wanting to change the world for her, he realized he had to change the world in his workplace, and it opened his eyes to what was happening in the workplace. So I think that's another area. The third area, that a big motivator for men, is actually something I touched on earlier, of actually being able to take off the straitjacket of complying with outdated male stereotypes. We talk to a lot of men who are really passionate about doing the school run these days.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talk to a lot of men who want to be the type of father and the type of husband that is a modern day man wants to be, that I was never able to be. Because
And I don't think it's until you ask them, is it, that you actually realize how many people feel that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we start giving men, stop telling them off and giving them permission to talk about these things and engage with them, what they realize is, when women are fighting for more flexible working, that they should join them, that it should be, we should change the narrative to an all of us narrative. When we're thinking about maternity leave, we should also think about paternity leave, and we should call it parental leave, yeah, because it's good for us all. The other really important thing I think that we need, and again, Gary talked about this earlier, is actually role models. Yeah, because we've celebrated the amazing achievements that a lot of women have done. I can remember, it was only probably 15, 20 years ago that I was stopped in my tracks because I saw a woman driving a bus. How ridiculous does that sound these days? Yeah, but she was a role model. Yeah.
Okay.
We need to role model men. Our leaders need to role model these behaviors. We were working with a board the other day, and we were having a conversation around the table, and one of the men put his hand up and said, I've got a confession to make. I do the school run on Wednesdays. Why should that be a confession? And why didn't he feel the freedom to be able to stand up and share that, not just with his leadership, his colleagues, but with the rest of the organization?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that seems a bit mind-boggling.
Yeah.
Okay. Gents, I'm very conscious of the time. So I know that I've had kind of three main takeaways: the visibility of male allies, the thinking process behind this not being, a monthly tick off, that it being a long-term transformational progress. The third being about recruitment, definitely not, quotas and ratios, but really looking into the recruitment process in general. I want to ask you, though, what are the takeaways that you would like to give the audience, the female audience to start with, and then potentially the male audience? So, both of you, what are the takeaways for the women in the audience today?
Well, actually, I think I started thinking about this question, Stephanie. I came to the conclusion that actually I wasn't going to separate between men and women.
Okay.
I think the takeaway
probably where we should have begun at the beginning, isn't it?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, and actually, it was worth saying that for the whole conversation, really. Right? We are making some massive generalizations, so we do recognise we're doing that too, as well. But I think the key thing for me is that how we can begin to make this an all of us conversation, not a women's conversation or even just a men's conversation. I mean, Mark and I do recognise that part of this journey is about creating that. There is a need for a safe space for men, as has been for a safe space for women. So I do think those things are important, but the more we can make this an all of us conversation, the better, right? That we deliberately make it something that enables everyone to be included, I think is really quite important. And then the second thing is to recognize that what we're asking of people is actually not a simple thing. I think it's actually quite a challenge. It's quite a hard thing. Back to my earlier point, if it was easy, we would have done it decades ago. So I think we need to realize that, and therefore realize that we are all learning on this subject, and we're all learning. The more we can learn together, the better, I think. But in our experience, and mine and Mark's experience, and this is key takeaway, we have seen change happen at a very individual level. We have seen people who perhaps weren't the most inclusive of colleagues actually begin to change their behaviors, and a lot of it is lots of very small, and I think you were kind of suggesting that, lots of small incremental change through to, am I running this meeting in the right way? Am I running this meeting inclusively that allows everyone to contribute? When we look at who does what within our team, are we being fair around that? Are we making sure that not everyone, it's not the same person that's having to do all of the hideous admin that no one likes doing, right? Are we making sure that everyone from time to time, within reason, gets opportunity to stretch themselves, to do something new, to get that exciting project? Even through to, are we creating the right social environment that doesn't largely benefit just one team, right? Are we always, is our social event, going to the pub on a Friday night, which we know that will deliberately exclude some people because they can't do that for whatever reason. So are we varying social events, or indeed, are we making sure that our social time is evenly spread across all of our colleagues, not just the ones that look like us, that sound like us, that we have a natural, more likelihood of affinity to? So I think this is the key takeaway for me, is that we can all change. It is up to all of us, and we can all do lots of very small things that will add up to a massive difference.
That's fantastic. Thank you. How about you, Mark?
Follow that, Mark. Follow that.
Sorry, Mark.
Sorry,
Yeah.
that's all right. That's all right, Gary. So I agree.
We've covered everything. Is there anything left for us to say?
I think there's a few. There's a few things. Yeah. So I do think we need to engage. The conversation needs to be an all of us conversation that includes engaging positively with men who've typically been excluded from the conversation, or excluded themselves from the conversation. I would suggest as well, because it's something, and we talked on it earlier, this inclusion muscle. Yeah, actually, we're all responsible for the culture, the behaviors and the values within our workplaces. Yeah, and it's something that we can change every second of every day. Diversity is quite often in somebody else's hands. If we get the culture right, if we get inclusion right, it will pave the way for everything else that follows. So let's have more of a focus. Can't forget diversity, but more of a focus on inclusion, because I think that will show a giant leap forward for everybody. I don't think women will be free and have all the opportunity and choice until men are free as well, from complying with outdated male stereotypes.
I think I just want to highlight, Faith, we have seen your comment as well. She's worried about a 17-year-old daughter starting off in the industry, and will things be exactly the same for her? I think not. I think, Faith, people are changing, and people are part of the conversation, especially the younger generation. And I really think it's about inviting, as you said, the right people to the conversation and flipping the table and asking the right questions. So let's see. Mark, Mary.
Yeah, Mary.
Oh, go on. I was going to say Mark, Mary and Gary.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So I was just seeing Gary coughing in the background there, and we do have to have a shout out for Gary because he's got off of his sick bed to be with us today. So thank you, Gary.
It's going to end on a...
Yeah. Just one thing about the younger generation. We have seen enormous changes. I've seen enormous changes in my lifetime. We need to ensure that continues and accelerates. But indications are, and there's plenty of research that shows that our younger generation and people coming out of college and universities, men are moving more to the right wing politically and in their thinking, whilst young women are becoming more liberal. That shows a gap happening at that amongst the young people in our society, and figures like Andrew Tate coming to the fore, I think is worrying, and young men are not doing as well in education, are finding life difficult and more challenging, and I think we need to recognise that and pull them back into the conversation.
Definitely. This is really interesting. I recently attended a Gen Z panel and just completely, the new wave of thinking. And our next panel discussion that we have in Detroit, we've invited a few of the younger generation to join the panel discussion so that we can have, as you've just said, throughout this entire leadership interview, both sides of the conversation, men and women involved, but both generations involved in the conversation as well. Mark, Gary, Men for Inclusion, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for sharing everything. I know we're going to put the book that you've mentioned for the audience to read afterwards. We'll send them some links where they can find out more about you and how they can work with you on a corporate level. From our side and the Women Automotive Network, it's nice to see everyone again. We hope to welcome you next month. On May 23rd, the next leadership interview will be with Vipka Stahl. She's the MD of Bugatti, and that's talking about diversity again as not just a tick of the box. And then obviously we have our two main summits. The first time that we're coming to America, so hopefully see you all for the Women Automotive Summit Detroit, June 4th, and then obviously the main flagship event in Germany, which Mark and Gary will also be joining us at in Germany on October 8th. So thank you everyone for your time and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.